Wow, you're a lot of people at a UX and UI talk. That's impressive. Thank you for coming. A couple of months ago, I went to New York and I visited the Madame Tussauds museum, I guess you call it. And they had a VR experience you could try when you actually could become a Ghostbuster. So being a fan, of course, we had to try this, and we got teamed up. So we were 4 people in the team, and we could see each other in the virtual world because we had helmets and there was tracking going on and stuff like that. And we got the guns, and we even got a proton pack, and it was super heavy, I might say. And we got sent into a virtual apartment complex in New York to hunt ghosts. So we did, and at one point I missed a gun. No, I didn't miss a gun, I missed a ghost actually. And it flew right through me, which I could feel because the proton pack also had a vibration vest, so it was kind of eerie. So I try not to miss those ghosts again. And we walked into physical doors in the virtual world. So we actually opened real doors in the virtual world. So that was pretty cool. And we went into an elevator and we went really up high, and it felt like a real elevator because the floor was vibrating a little bit and the sound was super good. So it really felt like a real elevator, apart from the ghost. And at one time there was stuff happening and there's an explosion, and we're on one of the top floors in a New York skyscraper. And the whole front part of the building blows off. And I'm a tiny bit afraid of heights. Yeah, so that was fun. And then they tell us that we need to go to the next building over using a fire escape ramp thingy, which is basically a plank between 2 buildings. And I could see the streets of New York. That wasn't going to happen. And actually, I tried. I put my foot on it, and I could feel it wobble. I felt the wind in my hair, and I hear it creaking. So I cheated. I actually had to lift up the visor to go over. Super nice. But there was also a bit of a glitchy avatar thing going on. So I looked over at my virtual teammate, and she has a gun going through her body. Yeah, exactly, yay. And at one time she was going through a door, but for her she went through the door, but from my perspective she actually walked through the wall. Not that good. So the tracking was a little bit off. You have a question?
Does that mean that she's the ghost?
Does that mean if she's a ghost? I think not. She actually was a Ghostbuster. That would have been a good point, though. No, she wasn't a ghost. But don't get me wrong, this experience was super nice. The material was fantastic, but it could have been better with just a few tweaks. So we live in a really exciting times. We have new technology popping up left and right, and we have new hot ways of interacting with your apps. But this also means there's a new way of interacting with your application, which means that UX is all of a sudden a lot more important than it used to be. It was still important, but now you can actually make your users sick if you do it wrong. I will go through the differences in augmented reality, mixed reality, and virtual reality, and we will scratch the surface of where we can go wrong, how to fix it, and give you a few pointers to keep in mind. And though many of these things vary from platform to platform, I still think we can learn from each and every platform, regardless of what we're developing. So my name is Jessica. I don't even know my own name. I'm Jessica. I run a startup with my husband, who's actually in the audience today. And we do mostly HoloLens development, so for the mixed reality world. We also do Windows development. But the HoloLens is a really fun platform, and mixed reality in general is super exciting. I do most of the UX and UI stuff, and he does most of the developing side of things. We do workshops and stuff like that. So enough about me. There are a lot of types of realities out there, and one would think that this is a fairly new medium, right? But both virtual reality and augmented reality has been here for a while, actually. So back in 1584, there's a scientist who wrote, let me say it so I get this right, "How we may see in a chamber things that are not." And this is actually his headline of a description of a technique called Pepper's ghost. And I mean, 1584, he describes stuff that is still current today. Kind of amazing. So this Pepper's ghost is an illusion trick, which was used back when you had sideshows and things like a woman turning into a gorilla and stuff like that. But it's also used in TV and at displays at exhibitions and shops and all that kind of stuff. And this has been around since 1862. So think about that for a moment. It's like augmented reality, 1862. But then we had stuff happening in a little bit faster rate. So in the early 60s, we got what is kind of known as the earliest multimodal immersive machine called Sensorama. So it was a mechanical device where you could watch some movies and stuff like that, and you could have, you got stereoscopic 3D in a really wide angle, and you had body tilting in the chair, and you had the option of aromas and wind as well. So that's kind of cool. And in the late 60s, Ivan Sutherland, he created a contraption of sorts, which is widely known as the first virtual reality and augmented reality head-mounted display. And it has the best name ever, the Sword of Damocles. I mean, come on, that's cool. And then in the 90s, we got virtuality. And this is where we have a large gaming machine where we usually see that at arcades and stuff. So we also have a lot of new stuff, of course, and it's going really, really fast. But what's the difference between these realities? So this is augmented reality. And it has come and gone, well, basically for a few hundred years now. But when Pokemon Go comes around, they actually cemented that this is augmented reality and it's here to stay. How many of you guys have tried the Pokemon Go? Yeah, basically all of you. I haven't, because I'm a stubborn Windows Phone user. Yeah, so that's my own fault. So this is when you augment the reality, or you add stuff into the reality, and you see the real world through a screen, like a phone or a computer or whatever, but you see the real world through a screen, not with your own eyes. And there's no interacting with the physical world. So this is actually also from Madame Tussauds, the exhibition, and this is the technique called Pepper's ghost, which is also funny because it's a ghost. So, few hundred year old technique, and they're still using it. A modern version, I should say. But of course, there are more advanced augmented reality devices as well, like DAQRI. This is mostly aimed towards the industrial use of things because it has like a ruggedized visor and a helmet and stuff like that. But they're also coming up with a lightweight version of that, but it's still also more for the industrial use. Now, virtual reality is when you immerse yourself into the virtual world. like I mentioned, the 90s arcade before. And if you look at this picture, it looks really, really dangerous because he's in this contraption, a circular contraption, and he has to strap in as well. And the most fun part about this picture is that the woman is actually telling him, pointing at something, like he will see that in the virtual world. And in this space, there's a lot of competitors, so this is just a few of them. There's like 1 million, and more is coming along as well. And some of them have external tracking, like the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift. Then we have mixed reality. And this is when you take the virtual world into the real world, but you can still see the real world with your own eyes. And the virtual objects can actually interact with the physical world. So I can have a holographic ball and actually bounce it off the table because it knows where my table is. Now, mixed reality, the term is changing a bit, and I will come back to that in a second. Oh, and these guys can be either tethered or not. So there's both ways. So we have the HoloLens and the Meta. This is the Meta 2, and there's also more on the way. So that will be exciting when this guy actually comes out with a consumer product, because both of these are still a developer kit. Windows Holographic is the possibility to run Windows apps on the HoloLens. And this is also made available for the VR world. So you can develop a Windows application and you can run it on your favorite virtual reality headset, which makes it a little bit more easy. And you can even run your 3D apps for HoloLens in the VR world. And Microsoft also announced that they are collaborating with a lot of VR headset manufacturers. And they're bringing the inside-out tracking to VR headsets. And this is the way that the HoloLens is keeping track of the world around it. So all of a sudden, your VR headset will know where the table is. They will know where your chair is and where your couch is, so you will not be blind anymore. So that will be fantastic when that comes around, I think. So now that we know the difference, it's time to get to work and identify the experience. And here you need to think long and hard on what type of experience are you designing. I tried the NASA's Destination Mars on the HoloLens. So you go into, with a group of people, so we were 8 people, and we got into this room, and it's a really dark room. It's black floors, black ceilings, black walls, black everything, and there's some white or yellowish squiggly line all over. But the cool thing is that NASA has collected all of the data from the Mars rover and from the orbiter, so you can actually walk around on a piece of Mars. So you can go and explore Mars and look at cracks in the rock bed and stuff like that. So that's pretty awesome. And even better, it's Buzz Aldrin who's a virtual guide. So that's really cool. But it's a fully immersive experience. So I would say that this would actually be much better suited for a virtual experience. And also, it doesn't take advantage of the platform strength. Like in this case, it was a HoloLens, and it didn't make use of my walls and my floor and my tables and stuff like that. So that's what I mean when I say that you need to think about the experience. Do you want a full immersive world, or do you just want to add some information on top of other stuff? And being that it's popping up devices really fast at the moment, it's super important to also identify the kind of tech you are running your game or app on. Because there isn't one VR experience or one AR experience anymore. So think about where you want to be, what tech is going to be used. And in the 2D world, we can design and develop one solution and release it on every platform with little or no harm. Worst thing that could happen, and this happens to me a lot, it's like I get in my Windows phone, I get iPhone buttons or Android buttons and stuff like that, or I get back buttons, even though I actually have a physical back button on my phone. That's the worst thing that can happen. I get a little bit meh, but then it's over. But if you do that in the 3D world, you will make your user sick. So, next up, identify the play area. And I use the term play area lightly because I don't mean that you only can develop games, but it's easier if we just have one common term, right? So there's a few different types of areas to work with, and the experience can differ a bit. So first up is the stationary or almost stationary, where the user sits by their desk or on the couch, or they can even be standing up, but the point is they're not moving around that much. And then we have the location-based room scale, where you have a custom rig, like at a museum, and you may have a permanent chair in the physical world and the real world, and you overlay that with like a throne. So you can walk around in this museum and see worlds past and all that amazing stuff. And then when you sit down in the throne, you can look like royalty and wave and stuff like that, but really it's a chair from IKEA. And then we have the more common room scale, which is when the user can walk freely within the tracked area, like the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift. And the actual tracking differs even between those two. And I think the Vive has the ability to track 15 by 15 feet, and the Oculus have actually different types of areas. It has a smaller area, but it also depends on whether you have 1 camera, 2 cameras, or 3 cameras tracking you. And also when developing for tethered devices, you need to make sure that the user doesn't jank out the power cord or the cord from the computer. Or even worse, jank it and the computer falls down and breaks. So you need to think about stuff like that. But then again, if you're developing for HoloLens or DAQRI or a phone, you don't have those limitations. So that's why it matters where you're going to have your solution. And the HoloLens is using something called world scale. So it has built-in sensors. It has 4 environmental sensing cameras that is constantly scanning the area, so it keeps track on where's the chair, where's the stain on the floor, where's the curtain, where's the vase, and stuff like that. And where I am according to that, in that world. So, now we have the play area. How does the user move in this defined area? Well, the most classical way is, of course, the gamepad. And this will work with most platforms right out of the box. And most people are familiar with that as well. And then we have teleportation, and this is a common way to move if you need to move longer distances. In the lab on HTC Vive, you have a controller in your hand and you project a beam on the floor so you know where to go. So you just press a button and you're teleporting there. And on the PlayStation Vive in Batman Arkham, you see a small controller and a bat symbol, and that will take you to a predefined area. So you don't have the same choices, but you will go to a certain area. And this is actually a little bit easier to know from the start that you will teleport somewhere. Whereas the HTC Vive, I really like that you have the choices, but there's some learning to be done before you know how to do it. And then we have physical movements, so like walking. And sometimes it's a really good idea to not have the user walk the actual distance. So shorten the distance in the game, if that's not part of the game, of course. so they don't have to walk a couple of miles to get to the next village, because that can be kind of tiresome. So decide if you want to use one of these, or two of them, or all of them for that matter. That's a good idea also, to use more of them. So now we know how to move. How do we interact with the world? Well, we have a lot of new ways of interacting. We have human interactions that are new, but we also have new types of controllers. It might not be super new, but if you compare it to, 30 years of 2D development, it's kind of new. So the first one we already talked about, it's a gamepad. And the HoloLens comes with its own clicker, and the HTC Vive have their own controller, and so does the Oculus Rift. And the Oculus one looks a little bit funny when you see it the first time, but it's super sleek, and it's actually tracking. So you hold it in your hand, and it can actually track whether you have your thumb on the trackpad or not. So my virtual hand is raising the thumb if I'm not, and the same with the trigger fingers. That's kind of neat. And some of these devices is Bluetooth enabled, so you can actually use your regular mouse and keyboard. Now, it might not be the best idea to do that if you're in a fully immersive world and you actually can't see the keyboard. So you can't take that for granted as well. But if we go back to the HoloLens for a minute, first time Jimmy, my husband, tried the HoloLens, I hadn't tried it back then. He came back and he was almost out of breath. He was like, the mouse, it popped out. I'm like, calm down, what did you get to try? So he tells me about this architectural demo. So you stood by the computer and you had a mouse and keyboard, and you were in like SketchUp or some 3D application like that, and you could raise the roof with a mouse, and then you had a hologram to the side of you, and it actually raised the roof there as well. So that was kind of cool. But then he got all excited again. And the instructor had told him, put the mouse cursor on the top of at the very edge of the screen. So he did. And then he said, keep going. And he did. And the mouse cursor popped out in the real world. You can see that here. So all of a sudden, you have a mouse pointer floating in the air, so you can actually manipulate the hologram directly without any programs. So this is apparently the best thing since sliced bread. So my point is here that some users will use mouse and keyboard, and some will not. But if you make the experience so you can support both, you will have users like Jimmy raving about this for years. So for the devices that has hand tracking, like the HoloLens and Intel and a few more, you have a couple of predefined gestures. So this is the air tap. Really simple, right? Nothing to it. And when you click, you trigger a click event. So what happens is contextual and completely up to you. But some apps have also implemented their own versions that isn't the generic ones that comes with the device, right? Like the Superman flight. Now, although I do approve of the superhero part of this, you need to think about the user standing like this, flying for hours. Might not be the best idea. So that's a word of caution. Especially when you want to implement stuff like the non-standard versions. So I've been demoing the HoloLens for probably a year now, and for thousands of people, and I've been using the predefined gestures, and it's easy, right? But I've seen them all. I've seen the angry duck, I've seen the Pac-Man, and I've seen use every single finger but the one you're supposed to. So my point is that what's obvious for you is not that obvious for the user. So for me, this is, what the hell are you doing? It's super easy, but they have to learn it. So keep that in mind before you implement your own stuff, unless it's a web shooting, Spider-Man's web shooting gesture, then I'm all for it. Now gaze, this is basically where you look. If the device doesn't have eye tracking, it's actually where your head is pointing. So you have like a line between your eyes, like this. And it's a good idea not to execute on every single move when it comes to gaze. Because if you're just panning around the room and you have a lot of menus popping up and you even have sound to them, you will hear like ping, 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 ping when you move around. So make sure that the user actually wants to interact with that menu. So an example would be you have a menu item and your user is looking at it. So you pop up a menu either under or to the side or whatever with the actual click event. So you know when they actually look at that, they meant to click. And some also has timed versions, like you look at it and then you see a progress bar, and when it's full, that's when they trigger the event. Voice is another way of interacting, and you should really make voice your best friend. Because most users already know how to speak. So that's easy. And it's usually much easier to just say, hey, take a picture, than actually going through the menus, even if you have a controller or if you're doing it with your eyes and stuff like that. So that's important. And it's also important to think about the design of the language itself in the app, but that's a whole other presentation, so I won't go into details of that, but it's good that you think about language design when you use voice. And this is also why services like Alexa and Cortana and Siri is so popular, because it's super easy. And today, more and more devices get services like this integrated. The HoloLens, for instance, it has an array of 4 microphones, and they sort out your voice from your friend's voice from the ambient sound of the room. And it works actually amazingly in most situations. So that's a really good idea. So with all these new ways of interacting, really cool ways, might be tempting to design something that looks like a mix from Minority Report or Star Trek or things like that. But this might not be that fun if you've done it for 8 hours in a row. So you need to think about that as well. If you're doing it for a longer period of time, the user experience is not that good anymore. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use stuff like the Superman flight or using the Force and stuff like that, but use it sparsely because it might get strenuous. And also, if you use it sparsely, it will be more fun. So, now that we know how to interact with the world, but how does the user interact with the user? Now, how does the world interact with the user, I should say? So being that we are in these immersive worlds, it gets really hard sometimes to actually get the attention of the user, because they're over here admiring whatever you designed over here, and you're trying to get their attention over here. And there's another problem. We don't have set frames anymore to anchor our information to, like when you have the menu to one side and you have all the content in the middle and stuff like that, because all of a sudden our canvas is 360 degrees. And we don't even know which way the user will look. Well, we could just anchor stuff to the camera, so wherever the user looks, they will have the information they need, right? But be careful of putting stuff in people's faces, because it's not that nice. And also it can actually obstruct you from seeing other stuff. So if I have a large menu over here and you're trying to get attention over here, I can't even see it. And second of all, it can actually make you cybersick to have a lot of things going on up here at the same time. So don't put all the information on screen at all times, because it will get cluttered very quickly. So unless you are designing for Iron Man, or the information really needs to be shown at all times, use contextual menus and actions. But also be careful on how you do that. On the Destination Mars that NASA did, they made a really great solution. So you look at something, and I look at the rock bed here, and there's a menu popping up, and I click on something, and I get a submenu on the same place, so it's still contextual. Really nice solution. But I've seen examples where they've done a super sleek design, really nice animations, super sexy animations, but I'm looking at my item over here, and they have this awesome swoosh going on, and I have this orbs in the 3D world, which is my menu item. So I'm over here, and all of a sudden my menu item is here. So it's no longer contextual. So you need to think about the relationship between the context and the nested menu items as well. If you have information or labels that you need to place out in the 3D world, put them on the same z-axis as the object you are trying to label, even if that means that it will be partially obstructed. Otherwise, it will feel a bit off. But how on earth are we getting the attention from the user? There are a few tricks we can use. So we have visual cues. Those are a good help. It can be like a throbbing glow or something that we want to draw attention to. But make sure you don't do it just once and then never again. Because if the user was turned around and looking at your amazing things you've done, they might miss it. It doesn't have to glow and pulsate all the time. You can do that a couple of times, and then you can just have a subtle glow or something like that. So they know they can actually do something there. And with virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality, we also need to apply some spatial thinking. So because we have a completely different canvas. And one thing will become more important than ever, and that is audio. If you have multiple objects that has the ability to actually make sound, make sure you attach the audio controller to the actual items that can make the sound. This spatial audio will actually help the user to find wherever the stuff is, and if they're turned around, they know exactly where they are. So utilize that. And then many of these devices use gaze, as we talked about earlier, and not your physical hands. And another thing that will help us get a more physical sense about the objects is a phrase which is kind of funny because it's haptic audio. And I know you can't really touch sound and stuff like that, but if you give the surfaces and the object lifelike sound, it will almost become tactile to the user. Is the character running on grass or snow? Is this hollow or not? Is this stone made of paper or actual stone? This will actually also be clearer to the user which items they can interact with or act on. Like, can I actually lift this stone if it's made of paper? Sure, but otherwise, maybe not. In designing for a 2D world, we have learned lately that we should be genuinely digital and we should not use skeuomorphism or imitate the real world. But in the 3D world, That's exactly what we're going to do. We need to imitate the real world. This video is a great example of why haptic audio is important. Well, you get the point. And same thing goes for audio cues as with visual cues. We need to make sure that the user actually knows that something is going to happen, so they can move on, right? So let's say you are developing a game and you stand in the middle of an antique shop or something like that, and the user is mesmerized by all these beautiful antiques you've made. So they don't notice that there's actually a bad guy running towards you from that side. So you let a mouse run over the counter behind you. So you can hear him squeak and you can hear his little paws on the glass countertop. A good practice here is to use steps of 3. So first the mouse runs over the counter. So you let the user know that, hey, something is happening over here. And then you might have another mouse or 2 run over the counter as well, which will actually really be, hey, any second now. And the third one, you have a whole horde of mice running around, actually running from the bad guy who's coming to do bad guy stuff in your antique shop. Then they will really know that something is going on. So, audio is really important for the experience. And it can also help with the field of view. Now in virtual reality, you have a 360 view, basically, because everywhere you turn, you can see stuff. But in the HoloLens, for instance, then you have a printer-sized paper like this, with arm-length distance. That's your field of view. But I've actually tried a game which is fantastic. It's called Fragments. And in one part of the game, I'm talking to a lady over here, and I hear a sound over here. So I turn around, and there's a freaking holographic lady sitting in my sofa. And she's not hovering above it. She's not sitting like almost in the couch. She's sitting in my couch. But because we had that visual cue, well, the audio cue over here, all of a sudden my brain thinks that the world isn't this big anymore, it's all the way around. Yeah, sometimes VR is, funnily enough, called vomit reality. How many of you have ever been nauseous from virtual reality? Yeah, I would say about half of you. This makes UX and UI really, really important because if you're a little bit off, they will get a little bit sick. So the fact is that we haven't cracked the nut that is motion sickness. We don't know why. We have some theories and some workarounds and solutions, but it's still a fairly new medium, and both the tech and the UX research is ongoing now. We are writing the guidelines as we go. So there are 3 prominent theories when it comes to the cause of cyber sickness. The first one is poison theory. And this is based on the theory that the body will interpret the virtual world as hallucination. And the hallucination is corresponding to some sort of poison. So the body goes into survival mode and don't want to risk you having more magic mushrooms in your stomach, so it will try to expel it. And then we have the postural instability theory. And this is based on that the main goal of the human body is to be stable in all environments. So prolonged postural instability will make you sick. So sudden changes in the environment of VR can give you postural instability and therefore also cyber sickness. And the third theory is a sensory conflict theory. So It's when you have a conflict between two key sensory systems, and it's a visual sensory system and the vestibular. So they provide information about the person's orientation in the real world and the perceived motion and the mismatch in these senses. So the vestibular system is telling you that you're stationary, but your visual senses are telling you that you're moving, and we get a problem. So we have to work kind of hard to work around this as much as we can. But what we do know about cybersickness is that there are a lot of individual factors that matters. So for instance, children between the age 2 and 12 are more prone to be susceptible to cybersickness. And as they grow older, it will actually rapidly decrease. Women have a wider field of view, which means we are more sensitive to flicker, and therefore also cybersickness. And there's also research showing that the female hormones can affect the susceptibility as well. Underlying illnesses or even hangovers will also have an effect. And whether you're sitting and standing, and your posture will also have an effect on that. Things like latency and flicker can induce cybersickness. So this is why it's so important to actually test your solution on the actual type of device you're going to run it on, and not your monster machine you're actually doing the development on. How is the user moving around? Are they riding a train? Are they driving a car? Are they sitting stationary, not moving a muscle? Now, sure, we can try to safe it and let the player always be stationary. But first of all, it won't solve all your problems because we're all different. And also, what's the fun in that, right? So when you are fully immersed in this cool world, we tend to walk around and want to explore this. And as I said, there isn't one magical solution. So what's working for me might make you sick, and vice versa. So if you have the budget for it, and if you have the time for it, you could enable one or more ways of navigate. So this will actually make the app compatible to more people. So that's a good thing. Free roaming, it's fantastic because you move around and you discover all that awesomeness, and some people will get sick. It's as simple as that. You could try to fix that by giving the user a virtual body, because that will help a lot if it's done right. But if the avatar isn't corresponding to my own body, if you're rendering it a bit below the floor, or like the New York Madame Tussauds edition where she had a gun going through her stomach, that can actually make you sick. And even if you have semi-good tracking, or semi-bad perhaps, where the avatar is walking really funny, it can also make you sick. Some people prefer a third-person view, which will be much more comfortable for them, but then again, it doesn't work for everyone. But if you put your user on a vehicle or something that's moving, especially if you're going for unpredicted turns and stuff like that, the user may very well be sick. A friend of mine, his name is Max, he's a professional game developer, and he got together with a few friends and made a game called #Archery. And at one point in the game, you're standing on top of a moving truck. But people got really sick. The feedback was really bad. And they are really good developers. So what they had to do was lock the rotation of the tracking space. So it's kind of like when you're standing in the middle of one of those accordion buses or articulated buses. So the horizon is no longer turning with you as it would in the real world. That will also help a lot. And another trick when it comes to driving and motion is show the road. So the human brain actually can have some sort of predictability on what's going on ahead of them. Is there coming a curve and stuff like that? And this is actually something that works in the real world as well. Because I tend to get a little car sick. Not that bad, but if I'm on my computer and not see the road, I might get sick. But then again, if I see the road, that goes away. So here you might use transporters or blink to move. And again, if it isn't a part of the journey, of course. So since there are so many individual factors that can affect your experience, and we're taking away so much stuff from the interface, from the actual user, we need to make a little bit more effort to user research and testing. And testing should never, ever be skipped when it comes to augmented reality and even mixed reality, and especially not in virtual reality. The testing should preferably be done really early and quite often as well. And it's best if you actually you test on the same type of audience you want to reach with your solution, and not test it internally in the developing team or with your friend who is a really VR nerdy guy or something like that. Heck, have your grandmother test it. She will probably be the best tester ever. There's also a couple of tips that could make things a little bit easier for the user, and some of the users will be fairly new to this kind of apps and games. So ease them into VR. Don't just put them smack in the middle of this immersive world. Start them out in a lobby, like the Oculus Rift. They have a virtual lobby or waiting area where you actually need to click play to actually go into the game. Use tutorials and how-tos. This is a great way, and almost a necessity, I would say, so the user actually can know how they can interact. And make sure that they can actually go back and take the tutorial again, or if their friend is playing and stuff like that. And if you're going on an elevator ride or a balloon flight or similar to that, it's a good idea to have a still focus point that the user can focus on so they don't get sick. It's also good to let the user know if they are too close to a wall or a chair and stuff like that. In mixed reality and augmented reality, we get it for free, but in the virtual world, at least at the moment, we don't get that for free. We will in the future, but the user will actually be more immersed in the experience if they can trust that you will tell them when they're about to run into the wall. And in mixed reality, we have the field of view issue. It can be a little bit small. So you can counteract that by either making the holograms a bit smaller so they can actually fit inside the field of view, or you can put it even further in the actual world, so it's a little bit of distance to you. But your brain is so fantastic. I don't notice the field of view anymore, because if I see a hologram and it's too big, I actually automatically back away without even thinking about it, because my brain is compensating for that. So that's something really good about that. Smoothing should also be your best friend, especially when it comes to things like gaze and gaze cursors. And even more so if you're actually reading the raw data of the gaze, because that will become really, really jittery, because even if you think your head is still, it's really not. So that's where smoothing comes in. And also fade out of VR. Don't just pull the cord, so to speak. It's a much more pleasant experience if you fade to black when the user is leaving the VR experience. So where are these techniques heading? What's the future? Well, we have so many cool devices already today, and we have so many cool sensors that we could integrate into that. We can measure if our palms are sweaty, even how sweaty they are. We can measure your pulse, and the differences in our voices, and temperature, and vibrations, and we have all the IoT stuff as well. So, if we also include eye tracking, you can have the players, the virtual characters, actually look you in the eye, which will be kind of scary, but are you trying to cheat on the personal trainer experience? Or have you put them too far up high in the streets of New York so they actually have to cheat? Are you scared enough yet? Or do we need to crank it up a bit? So to sum things up, identify the experience, the tech, and the play area. Think about the interaction, both from you to the user and how the world interacts with the user, and vice versa. And try to make it as comfortable as possible for the user so they don't get sick. And if there's only one thing you should take away from this, it is testing. You can't tick all the boxes in making the perfect solution for everyone, but if you keep testing it enough, you can come pretty darn close.